Well, welcome everybody to the second day of United Days. Our theme for these past 2 days has been spirit and struggle, acting toward a shareable world. And the title and the theme comes from two great thinkers of the 20th century and people who acted on their thinking. Rosemary Freeney Harding, who was married to Vincent Harding, two civil rights activists. Rosemary Freeney Harding and Vincent were Mennonite missionaries of a certain sort. They ran a house in Atlanta, Georgia called Mennonite House, and it was a place of hospitality, of welcome. It was one of the first multi-racial ministries in the United States. And the second person was Toni Morrison, who spoke of a shareable world in the context of her reflections on home in a book that she wrote called The Source of Self-Regard. And she said that, this is a quote from that text, "It is a virtual question because this is the question of what do we mean when we say home? What is home?" She says, it is a virtual question because the destiny of the 21st century will be shaped by the possibility or the collapse of a shareable world. So both Toni Morrison and Rosemary Freeney Harding believed in, had a very capacious understanding of home, the sharing of one's home, the possibility that the world as a home can indeed be shared. And they had what we might call a theology of abundance. We reflected a bit on this yesterday in Uprising Theology, the workshop that Reverend Rasmussen and Dr. Levad led us through. If you weren't able to be there present for that yesterday, I encourage you to look it up on the YouTube channel, on the United YouTube channel. Really wonderful workshop that they did that reflected on abundance and discerning abundance in our lives, but then also abundance as the ground for a vision of a shareable world. And before I introduce our speakers this morning, I wanted to read something that came to mind this morning by Rosemary Freeney Harding and her daughter Rachel. And this, I think, gets at kind of the heart of what we're reflecting on over the last 2 days, and I think might introduce your talk this morning as well. So this is from a book called Remnants, a memoir of spirit, activism, and mothering, a book I highly recommend. It's written by Rosemary Freeney Harding and her daughter Rachel. So this is the poem or a prayer. We can call it an opening prayer. There is no scarcity. There is no shortage. No lack of love, of compassion, of joy in the world. There is enough. There is more than enough. Only fear and greed make us think otherwise. No one need starve. There is enough land and enough food. No one need die of thirst. There is enough water. No one need live without mercy. There is no end to grace. And we are all instruments of grace. The more we give it, the more we share it. The more we use it, the more God makes. There is no scarcity of love. There is plenty and always more. Our speakers this morning are Nikki McComb and Dr. Mike Klein. Nikki McComb, an artist and owner of Art Is My Weapon, has been working in North Minneapolis to promote youth and family achievement for more than 20 years. Her 2016 public safety campaign, #Enough, used art as a catalyst for change and social disruption. Through Art Is My Weapon, local artists use decommissioned guns to create art displays that engage the public, community leaders, and elected officials in respectful conversations about reducing gun violence. McComb's photos and videos offer communities an outlet where they feel safe enough to seek help, empowered enough to give help, provoked enough to work harder to unify, and unified enough to collectively make change. Welcome, Nikki. Dr. Mike Klein is an associate professor of Justice and Peace Studies and department chair of Justice and Society Studies at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. His research, writing, and consulting focuses on democratizing leadership, critical pedagogy, peace building in the arts, intersectionality, and racial justice. Mike is also a public artist working in sculpture, murals, and photography that address pressing social issues. Klein was a 2007 Bush Foundation Fellow, completed the James P. Shannon Leadership Institute in 2011, and is an inaugural member of the Washington National Cathedral's Sacred Spaces, Racial Justice, and Spirituality in Action. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Sure. I had a frog yesterday, so I just can't get rid of it. Thank you.
How about since the frog has taken over, I'll start us off and then I'll hand it back over to you, right? We want to thank you very much for coming today. It is a beautiful morning. There are lots of other places you could have been and you chose to be here. So thanks for being here with us. We're excited to be able to talk about this, and in the light of Rye's very generous introductions, that idea of a scarcity mindset that we're trying to set aside, this abundance that we want to embrace. I hope that's a part of this, even as we're talking about a very difficult and pressing social issue around gun violence, right? That we have this very difficult time that we're dealing with, and we have this very creative approach that we're trying to use to address it. So I'm thrilled to be here alongside Nikki McComb, and I think we're going to start with a little art activity. We want to get you involved with doing a little art instead of just listening. So I hope at 9, 10 in the morning you're willing to take a little risk and step forward. I'm going to describe that briefly and then pass out some supplies while Nikki talks about what Art Is My Weapon is, where it came from, and gives you a little more sense about it. And one of the reasons that we're doing it this way is because when I've done this presentation in the past and left the art supplies out, it was a little triggering. And I mean the pun of that, right? We're talking about guns, and some of the objects that we use and some of the themes that we get into are very difficult. For many of us, violence is present in our lives, and we've been affected by these issues. So we try to be a little careful about how we step into this space. I'm going to pass around 38 caliber shells, and I'm going to pass around some little pieces of wire. And I'm going to invite you to do a little creation, if my clicker will work. There we go. So one of the ways that I've been responding to this project is by making little insects out of those shells and with wire. And I'm going to invite you to make your own version of this. Right? To take a piece or two of wire and a shell and just start twisting into wings and legs and stingers and whatever comes out of your imagination in the moment. And we'll explain more about why we're doing this art project and how it'll move from here as we get into the presentation. So I'm going to start passing around. If you don't want to take one, if this isn't your thing this morning, you can simply put up your hand or smile and not put out your hands. And I'll move on, right? But as I pass these out, I'm going to offer the floor back to Nikki so that she can talk more about art as my weapon.
Thanks. Do I need this? Do I really? I do need it, because now I feel fancy. So, art is my weapon, as it says up there, is a 501c3 that was established. I used to work in a place called Pillsbury United Communities, if you've ever heard of it. And at the time, it was led by one of my very good friends, Shonda Smith Baker. And while I was there, Shonda had gone to the Ascend Institute and met a gentleman named Jonathan Ferrara. And Jonathan Ferrara is an artist out of New Orleans who created a concept called Guns in the Hands of Artists. And so he brought the exhibit to Ascend, and she saw it, and when she came home, she told me she wanted to bring the exhibit to Minneapolis. So I was like, okay, what are we gonna do? So we brought the exhibit. It was very profound, and in 2011, Shonda had lost her cousin to gun violence, and so she was very moved by the exhibit and said, I want to do my own. I want to create something here. I want to model this here. And because I'm an artist and because we were friends, she was like, and you're going to do it. And I was like, okay. So we came up with the title. Technically, well, she chose the title, and we worked diligently to produce a gun buyback that got about, I think it was about 150 weapons off the street. They were decommissioned down into about 500 or so different pieces. And that's how I actually met Mike, because he came, got some pieces, and created some artwork for the exhibit. And many other artists did the same. Shonda moved on in her career into another position. I also moved on from Pillsbury, but I was not willing to stop the work that Art is My Weapon had started. And so I went to Shonda and the interim CEO and asked if I could take ownership of the organization, and they said yes. So since then, since 2016-17, I have had full ownership. Shonda is an ex officio board member. In between there was a shooting that happened very, very near one of the locations that I worked out of, which is right on Penn Avenue in Oak Park. It's called Oak Park Center. And I was leaving work, and I saw all this commotion, and I saw all these cars, and I saw, people crying and screaming, and I'm just leaving work. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? And so I just go through, and I get home, and then I get a call from a friend saying that somebody that I know, their mother was murdered on the corner in gang crossfire, and her daughter was in the back seat. So she was in. This is the woman's granddaughter in the back seat. And I was so mad. I was so angry. And I just could not think of any other way to do something other than using art as a catalyst. So I began to take photographs of people, first her, the daughter of this grandmother, asking community to come forward or give information or whatever. And so one of the photos, which I don't think is even accessible right now, was her very close up holding a sign up that said, "That was my mother." And so I put it online on my Facebook. I created this page, and all of a sudden, people started messaging her on her Facebook and saying, I know something. I know what happened. I know who's involved. I know this, that, or the other. And so she called me and she said, what do I do? I said, call the investigator. So all of these messages and the photo being circulated, the people were basically saying, I saw your picture, I'm so sorry, but this is what I know. So shortly thereafter, well, not shortly thereafter, about a year later, after the rest of the tips came in and so on and so forth, the suspect was apprehended. So I started getting calls from other people and other families, and I started taking photos of them and spreading them around and you know, hoping for people to come forward. So that was one part of the work that started. The second part was doing the work, the artwork, and the exhibitions, and making sure that people understand there's a whole lot that happens when one person is shot. There's a whole lot of people connected to it. More than one person is losing everything. The shooter, the family, the shooter's family, the victim's family, the victim. There's tons of people involved in just one shooting. And so I started doing other photographs similar to the one you see up there that kind of told different stories around how people are disproportionately affected by gun violence, primarily people of color. And so I would put my work in the exhibits as well. And then I tumbled into serving victims and their family members, and family members of victims who no longer are here. And then I tumbled into serving young people to prevent them from either being involved in a crime or going back to commit another crime. Or so I'm working with Hennepin County Corrections and the probation officers and Minneapolis Public Schools and so on and so forth. And so this will be a good time for maybe the video to come up, just to give a little bit of some of the programming that I do in schools with young people and families.
According to gunviolencearchive.org, more than 25,000 people were killed in gun violence so far in 2023. More than half of all gun violence deaths this year were deaths by suicide. There have been 131 mass shootings with 4 or more people wounded or killed so far in 2023. Violence is a learned behavior. Children are not born violent. Art is My Weapon is invested in community violence intervention and prevention using art as a catalyst for change. The Healing Hearts program can help your students, families, and professionals promote ways to cope, express themselves, and prevent violence. Visit artismyweapon.org to learn more.
This was the things that make you release, and what makes me release is I like looking at the sky, and I like dancing, and I like hearing the rain when it's raining outside.
It was fun. It was, I liked that I was able to get out the house and I was able to go do something with that besides going outside or walking around,
It was positive, and it took me to a different place in my mind where I don't normally express things.
I work with participants by creating space. A lot of people go through depression and anxiety. They have feelings of sadness and anger. And I think it's really important to channel that through art. I really got into art just by dealing with a lot of mental health issues that I had on my own, really struggling with communication and expressing myself. For me, this is home.
So I just have to tell a tiny little story. That the woman that was talking at the end her name is Crystal. She's one of the instructors in the Healing Hearts program. But if you notice that little girl that kept, this was the kindest, sweetest little girl in the world, and she was so like, "How do you feel?" "I feel good right now." And when we left, she came up to me and she said, "I will never forget your name. I love you, Miss Nikki." It was so sweet. So every time I see the video, I'm like, "Aw." Anyway, so the last exhibit that we had was the one that you see there. I also have a solo exhibition up at the Minnesota African American Heritage Museum that is called Full Circle. It covers the entire aspect of folks involved in a shooting, from the shooter to the medical professionals to the victims to the conceal and carry instructor. So if you ever make your way over that way, check it out. What else, Mike?
Well, part of what we wanted to talk about today is this story, right? And the difficulty, the pressing social issue of gun violence, but also about the way that art creates a different way forward. When we hear the news and we feel deeply the tragedy of this, or we get desensitized over time because it seems to be so recurrent and so common, art tends to interrupt some of those patterns of thought, right? Making things, even the work you're doing with your hands right now, activates different parts of the brain, creates space for new things to happen. And that's been very tangible and practical in terms of Nikki's work and in terms of this organization. One of the first shows that I became involved with in North Minneapolis at Homewood Studios, you were brilliant at inviting people into that space who probably wouldn't encounter each other otherwise. Mayor Fry and Chief Arredondo at the time were there. There were victims and survivors and families there. There were gun rights advocates, and there were gun restriction advocates in the space. There were all generations and all kinds of intersectional identities represented. And that art exhibit creates the opportunity to encounter each other. And what I think I see often in the examples, and even in the class that I've just done, and we've talked about that in a moment too, it's people who may not talk directly to each other, but by talking about the art, by having this third thing in the conversation, they can say, "What do you think about that?" And the person can say, "I think that represents." And instead of having to encounter each other directly, the art mediates the conversation. And it creates just enough distance to be able to say hard things at the art without saying hard things at each other, right? And so we open up a space for people to really listen, to engage, to be able to work through some of maybe the thoughts, the feelings, the things that we have trouble expressing. So the expression isn't just in the making of the art, although that's very powerful, but it's also in the encounter through the art with each other, right? And that's a part of what we're trying to encourage and kind of open ourselves up to not just policy issues, not just the latest news, not just the latest tragedy, but imagining new ways forward.
I want to say one thing, and I'm you probably can tell by how I've presented, but I'm a very in-your-face person, in case you didn't know. And so I'm constantly inviting those folks to the table. I think there's been 12, maybe 11 exhibits. Some solely young people working in one medium, some, most with gun part artwork. And every time I invite lawmakers and politicians and police and fire and everyone involved that happens to see or be at a shooting, they don't always come. That time it just so happened that they did, but the challenge is getting people to buy in, and when they actually come and they see, then later I get a call or an email or whatever it is, how can I donate? How can I do this? How can I do that? So, but it's a struggle. It really is a struggle to get people to come, and then they come and they're dumbfounded by what they actually can see. So art definitely, to me, is really the segue to getting folks at the table.
And really to be inclusive and disruptive at the same time, all right?
Disruptive for sure.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the shows have been in and around North Minneapolis or in the downtown area. You've had it at the Hennepin County Library downtown, right on Nicollet. This last show was in Edina, and it's a space that felt quite different from some of the other shows, and a crowd that was quite different from who might have shown up at some other ones. And it's about bringing this art out into the world in a way to create more space for these conversations, all right? I want to talk just a little bit about one of the pieces that I made that you're working on right now, right? So when we first started and I stood around that pile of guns down at Pillsbury United, it was a little overwhelming. These are objects that are not often in my life. I grew up in gun culture. I was a Boy Scout. We were shooting all the time. But when you see that pile of guns that came from a gun buyback, you wonder about the story behind each one of them, right? Were they handed down? Were they stolen? Were they purchased for self-defense or for some other more nefarious purpose, right? And you wonder what the stories are, but we don't know. We don't have the stories coming in with the guns, right? And the gun buyback is a powerful symbol of something. But there are 400 million guns in the US, more than one for every person alive as a citizen of this country. So we're not going to buy them all back. That's not how this is going to change, right? The gun buyback is powerful as a symbol. It's about transforming those decommissioned weapons into something that can speak to our hearts and transform us. That's where the work is. Right? It's not as much in the object as it is in our own hearts and our own way of thinking. So I found this pile of guns intriguing, disturbing, hard to know what to do with it exactly. And as I was trying to imagine what to create, I was having a conversation with colleagues at my university at St. Thomas about public health and guns as a public health issue. Right? And for many years, there was a prohibition against this, the Center for Disease Control studying gun violence. Right? It was a politicized effort to keep that research from happening. And it's been overturned now, the research is going on. But it points to the power of that metaphor of public health for gun violence. And as I was in that conversation, I started seeing the guns as insects, as something that carried the disease of violence, right? And so disease vectors, this description is by the World Health Organization with a couple little tweaks by me. It is about very much like a mosquito carrying Lyme's disease, or a malaria, or a tick carrying Lyme's disease, right? I started seeing guns as something that carried and magnified the violence, that made it more prevalent, that made it spread through communities. And so I started looking at guns as insects, and in this case, taking the wood off of the pistol grip and making wings out of it, taking apart an umbrella to make the legs. It feels sinister to me in a way, right? And I've made several pieces like this, but I've also tried to figure out, where does the violence come from? Where is it going? How do the guns transmit the virus? And a few of my students on seeing this said, wouldn't it be even more powerful if it was a swarm? Not just the one gun, but a swarm of insects, right? And that's what you're making right now. I've worked on this with students. I've worked with it at a peace studies conference. Now here in this setting, you're creating part of that swarm. Right? To talk about how the magnification of violence happens through this. Let me just say before you start worrying about it, you can either take that with you or leave it here to be part of whatever we do next. Right? So this is your creation, and whether you'd like it to be in our next exhibition or whether you'd like to take it with you as a reminder of what we're talking about today, you're welcome to do either. Right? I also heard a couple of people say, "Oh, I'm not an artist," right? I'll do this, but I don't want you to see what I'm making. And for many of us, we might have been exploring art for a long time, but we're always wondering how we're going to do what we do and what is it going to look like and is it good enough and does it read to an audience. To the students that I work with at St. Thomas, they don't see themselves as artists. Oh no, I don't make things. I'm not going to get graded on that, am I? We get graded in class on the thinking we do, on the reflections we have, on the way it transforms us, not on the object. And the same, I think, is true for Art as My Weapon. The art that shows up is a method of getting at our purpose, right? It's a vehicle for the work that we have to do. So the object matters, but it matters as much as it changes our hearts and changes our world. So I'd encourage you to keep making as we go. And if we have a little time at the end, maybe we'll do a little show and tell as you'd like.
Does it have to be able to fly?
You know, what we've done is usually just put it on some monofilament so you can't much see it. What I did for the last show is hang them from this big number 2. You get the reference, right? The Second Amendment is something that we think of as sacrosanct, something that's at the heart of the primary document of our nation, and yet look at what harm has come, right? And we have constructed that number 2, which means we can reconstruct or deconstruct or reimagine. The Second Amendment, right? Yeah, sure. And when I've been digging into this, one of the things that art does is it gives us a chance to explore, to research, to reimagine. And I've done a bunch of reading with my students now. I had a class this semester on making art for social justice. Nikki worked with us to connect that to Art as My Weapon. And we looked at the roots of the Second Amendment, really, which came out of slave patrols and reinforcing slavery and enslavement. It came out of land theft of native communities, right? And using art as a way to try, or not art, using guns as a way to reinforce that power dynamic that led to the genocide and land theft. So the roots of the Second Amendment are really in violence, in inequality, in many of the things that echo right up to the moments we're living in terms of gun violence. We don't tend to talk about that. We talk about our rights in the moment and the individual right that's now been enshrined in the Supreme Court based on the Second Amendment. But there's so much more to explore, and the art can help us do that in a way that is still political, but it's not quite as polarizing. It's, again, that third object, that third image that helps us differently navigate that space, right? And so I'm not going to say too much about this, but structure and freedom is something we talk about a lot. And when we have lots of artists in the room, we might give a lot of freedom to explore. That's what Art as My Weapon often does. And when we have lots of people saying, "Oh, I'm not an artist," then we try to give you some structure, like here's a shell and here's a wire and here's an idea, right? And enough room for you to feel like, yeah, maybe I could try that. Maybe I could create something. And in this work around gun violence, trying to figure out how to structure that freedom of the Second Amendment, how to structure the freedom of our engagement with each other is part of what we're trying to do. We've tried to bring this into many different audiences. So Nikki's, as she's mentioned, worked with very small children, worked with survivors in more clinical settings. I've been working in a university setting as students try to wrestle with this issue on campus, right? And it's not, even for a campus like the University of St. Thomas, it's not far removed. A few years ago, we had a gun go off in a residence hall, and someone in the next room was shot by that gun, even though guns are banned on campus. A number of years ago, we had a student who graduated and then went down to the 3rd precinct when the protests around Jamar Clark's shooting were going on there, and he shot 4 people. One of our graduates, and it took a lot of us by surprise and made us wonder, because we assume that education matters. We assume that education is what's supposed to get us beyond some of this. And here one of our recent graduates had posted racist videos, brandishing a gun, going down to mess with a protest, and ended up shooting 4 people, now in prison, and will be for years to come. So this is not far away from us. In my class this semester, I had 30 students, and 4 of them had direct ties to victims of gun violence, someone in their family who'd been shot. And one of our students, so profoundly moved by doing the art, but also still raw with the emotion of it, couldn't put her piece in the show that we did just Wednesday. It was just too close. Making the art mattered, but putting the piece out in that show was too much. Right? So this is some of the work that students did, and I'm amazed by this because, again, 30 students who mostly did not see themselves as artists, a few were amazing artists, but some of them just 5 weeks ago started imagining what could come. And they made wildly different pieces of art that reflected things like the Sacred Heart, but instead of a crown of thorns, it's a crown of shells. And really bringing that religious iconography forward. We had a student, I'm not sure where you're looking, I'll go here. We had a student who is indigenous and connected guns to her indigenous identity and history, right? And wanted to have a funeral for the tools of colonialism. We had students who wanted to sum it up very briefly and put out stickers in a way that many, many people could use and respond to. And others who are connecting things like the death of bees, of pollinators, to say there are living systems we need to respect, and there are many impacts or methods in society right now that are really degrading our life and our lived experience. I'm still processing some of what students did, and amazing to see people, again, who see themselves as non-artists, given just enough room and just enough attention on this issue to be able to create really beautiful and stirring images and objects.
I was dumbfounded by what they did. The one before on the other screen, with all of the little tweets and that so the it's like tweets from lots of people, different celebrities and different people that with opinions around different mass shootings that happened in the last, I don't know. I saw a couple on there that could have been applicable to even the Vegas incident, but that's just a small section of it. It was a whole, like inside of a bookshelf with a plethora of tweets that we probably never saw. Me anyways, because I don't go on Twitter. But I was just like, what? He said that? She said that? But you can go to the next, the next one. And I also, this photo doesn't know justice, but that is a fish tank. And the student she had been working on, I remember her working on the hands of clay. They were made of clay. And she had a whole different, she was like, I'm going to do all these little hands and we're going to do this. And this is a hand like with a bullet going into it set inside of resin. And so it looks like the hand was, and then there's some sort of lighting strip on there that's activated if you get loud around it. It's crazy.
If you made a loud enough noise, it would move from blue to green to red. And so rapping on the table, almost like a gunshot, gave you the red rapid fire, right? This one, it was these 3 students created the umbrella, and hanging from the umbrella are the stories of gunshot victims. And each of them a brief story, but a QR code leading to a website that told more of their story. And it was the first thing that you encounter as you walk into the library, and really stirring. I saw people standing there for minutes and really reflecting on and reading the stories and trying to take in some of the real humanity of this beyond the numbers, beyond the politics of it, right? This one, students, most of our students are 18 to 22 years old right now in college, and they've done active shooter drills since they were in kindergarten, right? And so they had a school desk and then kids' shoes running away from the desk. And a sign, I wish I would have put the sign up too, that just said stop, like a little warning sign. And then, how will we make sure every student gets to leave this school year, right? And survives the year in school, which to me was a very disturbing measure of where we're at, right? What I'm fascinated by in this, again, is creating just enough freedom with a purpose and with activities and with a chance to think about it, for these really wildly different conceptions to come out of students and to help us explore gun violence in many of its different manifestations. I think it's part of the power of art to be able to transform, to offer us the freedom to explore and to express and to encounter each other in the midst of that work.
And I got a couple new volunteers out of that class too.
Maybe a couple of new artists too. We'll see about that. Do you want to say a little bit more about your show?
Yeah, so Full Circle is, if you look at the photo there, each of those folks are subjects of the exhibit that are attached to what could possibly be. They're not all attached to the same shooting. However, a shooting affects tons of people. So right, there's a shooter, and if you look to the far right, you'll see that guy right there. That's one of my subjects. His name is Bradley Sewell. He's been in prison for 20 years. He shot someone when he was 15 for no reason. Like right now, he'll tell you right now, today, I was just mad. He challenged me, so I shot him. And, you know, I have probably 40 letters from him, and many phone visits and video visits of him, you know, telling his story and, you know, begging for help when he leaves, because he wants to become a part of the solution and not come out and be looked at as a part of the problem. So I've forged a relationship with him, a friendship, and I have been connecting him with different people in the community that can, you know, help him when he does come out. He comes out in 3 years. The guy next to him with the eyes is Mark Gorlick. He was a pediatric ER doctor for 25 years. Now he is the CEO of Children's. He has seen many children come into the hospital and just die right in front of him. He also has a book coming out that I'm not Save Our Children, I think it's called. And one of my photographs is the cover of the book. But he has a very deep passion for addressing this issue, and I actually met Bradley through him. So we all are kind of connected now, and you know, Bradley writes me all the time on my phone in the email, and I had been sick, and I was going through all kind of old lady stuff because I'm old. My bones are like, we don't want that no more. So I hadn't written him, I hadn't talked to him or any of that, and he wrote me, you know, in fear of me never talking to him again. And I said, no, that's it. We're locked in. You know, when someone needs you and they have or needs me and they have a desire to do something different, I'm there until I'm not. And so the guy in the upper left, that's Andre Locke. That's Amir Locke's father, who I've known since I was 18 years old. And so he was also in the exhibit because whether we like it or not, excessive force is gun violence when a victim when someone is shot. The guy next to him is a very high level conceal and carry instructor. He grew up on the north side of Minneapolis. When he was young, he was ducking and dodging and decided that he wanted to learn how to teach people how to use weapons. So he's an integral part of my organization, because when I bring him in, I give him the opportunity to share with people how to properly use a weapon, and get them in the know, because a lot of people don't know, which is why a lot of the shootings that are happening in such a chaotic way, because they don't know what they're doing. And so the woman in the bottom with her, she was robbed at gunpoint, and she was also held in her home without any clothing on by the police in a raid that was not meant for her home, completely naked, traumatized by guns and the act of using a gun. So the guy that's an instructor taught her how to use a weapon, how to protect herself. She doesn't own one because she still is not comfortable with it. But if she needed to, she would know how to protect herself with a weapon. The young guy with the locks, he was shot walking downtown, just kind of walking, going to get some pizza, got shot in some type of crossfire. And in the exhibit, there's photos of him with you can see his wounds. It went through his leg and it's his groin into his other leg, out the side. So there's two entrance and two exit wounds. He wanted to be a football player. He couldn't walk for a year. He had to learn how to walk again. So the exhibit shows all of that. And in tandem with that, there are some paintings and things that I did that relate directly to some of these people. And one of them is of Bradley. It's just kind of because he's a number to everyone else. He's not a human being. So it's just him with a number across his eyes, and a lot of the letters that he sent me, kind of little pieces of the letters that he sent me, so people could see, what someone in that position might say now, 20 years later. So I would just encourage you, if you have a second, to go there. I have received calls upon calls upon calls. Emails, news people, which is what I want. I want you to go there, and I want you to see and be in shock. This is the whole point. So yeah.
And that ever-expanding sense of the exhibit itself, right? That matters. But then everybody who sees the exhibit and takes that out and tells the story, the news stories that come out, the more people who come, the invitation is to come and see, go and tell. Yeah. Right? Try to spread that word.
Yeah. And there's we're doing a panel on the 23rd there at the museum with what are they called? The Minnesota
Justice Research Center.
The Minnesota Justice Research Center, with myself, moderated by the aide to Mary Moriarty, and some other folks around the issue. So it should be a pretty good conversation if you feel like going over there.
And we know that you appreciate art, right? We walk into this space and there is hardly a blank wall, right? Or a space for one more piece. So we know that you're already convinced of that. And I think we wanted to come and say, what could it mean for gun violence, right? We're trying to do that work, but we invite you into that work as well. How can you show up as an audience? How can you show up to support? How can you bring stories like this forward to be able to help change hearts and minds to address this issue? I want to express my gratitude to Nikki McComb for all that she has done, for the space she's created for me to step in as an artist for my students, for the really powerful work that Art as My Weapon is doing in community. So, to Nikki. And I think we'd like to open it up for any questions that you have in the minutes that we have left.
I'm a poet. So when you started talking about art,
You're an artist.
yeah, and nobody thinks that. They all think visual art.
No.
In fact, I've heard people say music and art. And, okay. So I started thinking words. And then I did the other thing too, but it always startles me when words are left out.
Yeah, that's at Art is My Weapon, words are not left out because some of the artists that are working in the schools and working with young people, they're teaching literary art, so they're doing poetry, songwriting, and helping young people use their words to figure out how to talk about the issue. And I literally there just was a thing on WCCO around my programming that we're doing at URock, and their little boys were writing. They were telling stories through poetry. So I feel you.
I also wrote.
Would you like to read it? Let's go.
To believe that it's okay to have these huge things available to tear into human flesh is beyond my comprehension, humble and unlived though it may be. It tears my heart in a whole different way, and my temptation is to block it out, to not think about it or feel about it or live about it. But really, can we do that?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lux. I'm a student at the seminary. And I'm curious, when you've had those experiences where a lot of different people from many sides of the issue are in your art space together, and I'm thinking about the mayor and the chief of police and then gun advocates, and what are tools that are there tools that you've needed to find to mediate conversation well, or do you find that the art does that well itself, or is there a way that, I'm curious what conflicts arise or what miscommunications have come up that you said, oh, I need a skill to be able to have this conversation, or this is a big conversation and I want a different arena for it. And then my second question for both of you is, what more would you like to do? Would you like this to be happening more in bigger venues? Would you like different kinds of collaborators, or how can you imagine this work growing? What, if you have a vision for that? Thank you.
So to your first question, I haven't had any sort of explosive experience with those folks all in the same room. The art does work its magic with people. There have been some very specific sit-down conversations around the art that we had at the library. And in that setting, when we're actually sitting to talk for a reason and a purpose, everyone has been very respectful and, even sharing their opinions that I have not experienced. I've actually experienced more crap at the buybacks where Yeah, where, you know, it's not illegal to pull up and open your trunk and offer money for the weapons. So we would have people, you know, gun owners and gun enthusiasts come and coerce our folks that were coming to get sell their weapons to come, and they'd pay more. And there wasn't really anything we could do about it. So that's been probably the worst that's happened in since 2016. Per your second question, I'm a big thinker, and this for me, you know, I'm constantly working on with my organization in this issue, and I would like to see this exhibit with the artists that I'm working with and the work that they've created over the last, you know, however many years it is, to be in Detroit, in the inner city, at their library for a month, 2 months, in Chicago, in the neighboring cities that have even higher shooting rates than we do here, in Baltimore, in all of these places where lawmakers are not doing what they need to do. And obviously there's a cost to that. So funding is an issue. I've been doing this work, you know, and I don't much pay myself. I pay the artists to work, and I pay for the exhibits, and I do whatever I can just to get one more inch closer to that goal that I just explained.
So let's think big. How about the U.S. Capitol, right? The rotunda of the Capitol building. That'd be a great spot for an exhibit like this, right? And I do think, to your first question too, to try to create opportunities for people to engage with each other. The shows, the opening exhibits, we all have our teachings about how you show up at an art show, right? Hands behind your back, don't touch the art, wine and cheese, all that stuff, right? And it kind of creates a setting where it's pretty hard to get straight into those arguments. So there is kind of a culture and an ethic of those that I think also shape the conversations. But we had real trouble trying to figure out where on campus we were going to do this show. We had people saying, oh, I don't want to trigger people. I don't want to be too confrontational. I don't want to raise hard political issues. Even the library said, could you put some of the easier pieces out front and then put most of the pieces in the back somewhere? So just negotiating the space matters. We also had a big whiteboard right when you walked into our exhibit. And in a week, it was filled. Right? It's like a 4x4 whiteboard, and both sides of it are filled with people making comments, which we promised not to erase. And there are some up there that I would rather not see up there. But we leave them up there so that there is a sense of almost asynchronous dialogue that's happening throughout the show. There were also little slips that people could write something about and put in a box. And one of our students on campus, not in my class, created a piece of art on this little Post-it note and said on the back, would you please add this to your exhibit? Can I participate? Can I make this and put it up? So we did. We just threw it right up next to some of the other pieces. So to be thoughtful about how people are going to engage, to give them the freedom within some structure to do that well, I think that's part of our ongoing challenge, to grow into that space even better.
Is that show still up or is it down?
Yeah, the show at St. Thomas is up until next Wednesday. The show at the is up at June 1st, and then your talk again is when?
The 23rd.
The 23rd.
5:30.
And there'll be another show in Northeast Minneapolis coming up in June as well. So
At the Quorum building.
there you go. Maybe we'll send that information out as soon as we can write it down.
Thank you both so much for engaging us with this work,
Thanks for having us.
for engaging our imagination, and it's such powerful work that you all are doing, and yes, we're very grateful. We're going to take a 15-minute break. We'll be back at 10:15 to hear Dr. Joy Ladin again.
Can I ask one more thing?
Of course.
Hold up what you were working on.
Okay.
Let's see what's out there. And if you'd like to contribute that toward our exhibit, toward that piece, you can feel free to leave it up here on the table. If you'd like to take it with you as a reminder or a catalyst for what comes next, please do that too.
Thank you.
All the little buggies, yes.
All right, I want to welcome you back to our space. Welcome to those of you tuning in online. My name is, I didn't introduce myself earlier, my name is Siggelkow. I'm the director of the Leadership Center for Social Justice here at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, and we're happy to have you back again for our second lecture from Dr. Joy Ladin. This is a lecture series, the Susan Draper White Lecture Series, which was established by Priscilla Braun, a graduate of 1983 of United, in memory of her grandmother, Susan Draper White. This endowed lecture series is meant to be in the area of women in religion, theology, and ministry, and we're really grateful to have Dr. Joy Ladin give the lectures this year. Today's lecture is entitled Babel and Beyond, Understanding and Responding to the Transformation of Gender. Dr. Joy Ladin is a widely published author, essayist, and poet, a literary scholar and nationally known speaker on transgender issues. From 2003 to 2021, she held the David and Ruth Gottsman Chair in English at Stern College for Women of Yeshiva University. Since transitioning in 2008, Joy has been featured in many NPR interviews, most notably On Being with Krista Tippett, as well as numerous interviews and profiles. Joy holds a PhD in American Literature from Princeton University, where she was awarded the Porter Ogden Jacobus Fellowship as top graduate student in the humanities. Due to health issues, Joy is joining us via Zoom. And I just wanted to mention when Justin first introduced me to Joy's work, I immediately saw in her writing a kind of a bridge builder of a certain sort. And that reminded me a lot of the great thinker Gloria Anzaldúa, who I was reading this morning in preparation to introduce you this morning, Joy. Anzaldúa speaks of nepantleras, bridge builders, people with a certain kind of consciousness that emerges, I think, for Anzaldúa because of her trans consciousness, her living at the border in between spaces. And these bridge builders, right, help us to connect across lines of difference, help us to take risks because of the riskiness that they are accustomed to in living on the edges, in living in between spaces, and sometimes living at the heart of borders. So it's through that experience, that consciousness, right, that I think one develops the capacity to create bridges and to create, in some ways, a new world. And so I'm really grateful, Joy, to have you with us, and I look forward to hearing you speak. Please welcome me in welcoming Joy. Please join me in welcoming Joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a thrill and an honor to be here again, and I may be blushing too hard after the comparison to Gloria Anzaldúa to actually speak, but I'm going to try to power through that. Let's just say it's probably better if you listen without comparing it directly to her work. I think I'll look better. It's hard to live in a world where many of us disagree, sometimes violently, about something as basic as gender. After all, most of us rely on gender to identify who we and others are. It can be confusing and enraging to know that others don't identify us the way we identify ourselves, and that the way we see others may not be the way they see themselves. For those of us who've always lived in terms of binary gender, as males or females, women or men. It didn't used to be that way. Many of us, including me, grew up in families and communities where binary gender seemed so universally accepted and understood that we never talked about it or even had a word for gender, either as a system or as an individual sense of identity distinct from physical sex. Those were the days. But thanks to growing awareness of trans and non-binary people, gender is changing. For many of us, gender seems like a battle we have to win, an injustice we have to challenge, a way of life we have to protect, something we struggle to understand, something we shouldn't have to understand, something we wonder if we will ever understand again. Whether or not we engage in them, most of us are aware of conflicts over what gender is and how it should be practiced. These conflicts can break up families, friendships, and religious denominations. They drive waves of anti-trans laws, embitter social media threads and Harry Potter discussions, multiply misunderstandings, inspire accusations, name-callings, and cancellations, and send some of us into exile from communities and traditions we love. Even if we keep our distance from them, many of us are quietly anxious about what gender is, how it is changing, and whether the language of gender that feels true to us will survive. That's why conflicts over gender are often so bitter. The language of gender defines how we understand ourselves, how we're understood by others, and where, and for some of us whether, we fit in a world where everyone is constantly identified in terms of gender. When we fight over what pronouns to use and what identities to recognize, we're fighting over the terms of our individual and communal existence. To my youngest child, a college sophomore, both public conflicts over gender and the widespread awareness of trans and non-binary people seem normal. But when I was growing up, gender and identity were not up for debate. I was born in 1961 into a strictly binary gender world in which my male body ensured that everyone would identify me as a boy. Not that anyone thought about gender this way. Other than me, no one I knew seemed to think about gender at all. When I was born, there wasn't even a word for gender as we talk about it today, as an individual sense of identity that's distinct from physical maleness and femaleness, as a system for assigning and recognizing those identities, as a shared language for naming and understanding them. Those meanings of gender began to emerge in the 1960s, when psychologists experimenting on kids like me, kids who were physically male or female but felt we were really the opposite, started using the word gender to describe how those we now call trans children were different from the vast majority who identified as the boys or girls their bodies and binary gender declared them to be. Even though binary gender didn't help me identify who I was, I, like everyone around me, assumed that everyone had to be either and only male or female, and that maleness and femaleness were unchanging essences, hardwired into both humanity in general and individual psyches through the sex of human bodies. The binary terms for identity that reflected those assumptions, male and female, man and woman, boy and girl, mother and father, daughter and son, and so on, seem to be equally universal, used and understood across cultures and languages by every human being, past, present, and future. But it was hard for me to understand myself in binary gender terms, even though I relied on it to understand everyone around me. Was I the boy my body said I was, or the girl I felt I really was? Maybe I wasn't human at all, an alien or a ghost, a mistake God made, an exception who had no place in the world where everyone else, I thought, in which no one else, I thought, ever asked about such things. It never occurred to me to question binary assumptions, or, as many have, to try to change the language of gender to include people like me who don't fit them. So I kept struggling to figure out what I was, what my combination of male body and sense of being female made me, until, at 9 or 10, in one of my mother's women's magazines, I stumbled across a word that described my tortured relation to binary gender. transsexual, which means someone born onto one side of the gender binary, but identifying as and needing to live on the other in order to feel authentic and whole. The word transsexual gave me a way to make sense of myself in binary terms by acknowledging that physical sex can be the opposite of gender identity. And most importantly, it confirmed that my sense of being female was real, so real that doctors would help me transition from one side of the binary to the other. And by changing my body so that others would no longer identify me as male, enable me to be seen and live as who I knew myself to be. The word transsexual helped me sustain my sense that I really was who I felt I was through decades of life as a boy, then man. I knew I wasn't. When, in my mid-40s, I finally began gender transition, transsexual gave me a way to explain what I was and what I was doing to family, friends, co-religionists, and co-workers who had never imagined that someone could feel so painfully misidentified in terms of binary gender. That was the mid-2000s. Thanks to the heroic efforts of trans activists, there was increasing awareness outside LGBTQ+ circles that not everyone is simply male or female. But that awareness hadn't reached the folks I knew, either at Orthodox Jewish Yeshiva University or in the small town in Western Massachusetts where I lived. None of us knew words like transgender or non-binary or gender non-conforming, words that frame these identities not as medical or social or psychological problems, but as different ways of practicing gender and being human. Whether or not those around me accepted my gender transition, no one saw it as challenging the idea that every human being is either male or female, or the binary language of identity we shared. My children still called me daddy, and I still identified as their father, because that was the language we had to express who we were to one another. Of course, by then, binary assumptions and language had long been challenged by trans activists, scholars, and younger trans people, many of whom rejected the word transsexual and its assumption that people who don't fit binary categories necessarily need to do so. But for years after I started publicly discussing gender in 2007, I resisted recognizing those efforts because I saw them as threatening the binary language I relied on to understand and express the female identity I'd waited so long to claim. I was really upset when early on I was invited to speak to a queer Jewish women's gathering, and they had a session on whether the word woman should still be used. And I actually asked everyone to just wait for a little while before getting rid of the word woman, so that because I'd just gotten here and I wanted to enjoy it. As you can see, that powerful group of people did not manage to abolish the word woman. So we're all good. Even in my 2012 memoir of gender transition, Through the Door of Life, I repeatedly described myself as transsexual, a word whose implications I didn't question until shortly before publication, an LGBTQ advocacy organization requested that, in talks I gave about the book, I use the more general and to me unfamiliar word transgender instead. By the time I got comfortable identifying myself as transgender, that term had also come to seem dated to those on the cutting edge of gender, with many, including eventually me, embracing vaguer terms like trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming that include anyone who doesn't fit binary gender terms, whether or not we transition. As awareness of trans and non-binary people spread in popular culture as well as LGBTQ circles in academia, more people embrace the idea that at least some gender identities are determined by individuals rather than by bodies or binaries or social systems. This was accompanied by an explosion of new terms for specific forms of gender identity that are often explained in diversity training handouts and online glossaries. These terms challenge not only binary language and its assumptions, but the idea of a shared, settled language of gender. Because, as many of the diversity handouts and glossaries note, the idea that gender is self-determined means that each of us is free to define our own terms for who we are. In other words, it's not your imagination. It is confusing. I had never imagined a world in which it was widely accepted that individuals, regardless of the sex of our bodies, can not only determine our own gender identities, but the terms in which we want to be identified. And I'd certainly never imagined a world in which the language of gender was so rapidly, spectacularly changing. As exciting as these changes were, they magnified the anxiety I'd experienced since I reluctantly began publicly identifying myself as transgender, trans woman, and then trans. Anxiety that the language of gender was changing in ways that threatened the meaning of the binary terms, female, woman, and transsexual, that for me most accurately expressed my sense of who I am. So I gradually grew accustomed to the fact that there were people across the spectrum who objected to me identifying as female and woman. My anxiety about losing the language of gender on which my life was based spiked again when, a few years ago, one of my children came out to me. Even though I should have known better, I always assumed my children would grow up to be the boys and girls, men and women, binary gender said their bodies destined them to be. But some years ago, one child told me that binary gender had been wrong about them, that they knew themselves as someone who was other than the gender we'd assigned them. The gender I'd always thought of them as being, the gender that was, those was part of the terms in which I loved them. Since I'd often counseled parents struggling to relate to after their children came out as trans or non-binary, it should have been easy for me to accept the long-hidden identity my child shared with me. And as a religious person, I should have celebrated learning who God made my child to be. Instead, I found myself plunged into the same whirlwind of grief, confusion, and anxiety the parents I counseled had described. How could I not have known who my child really was? Had I ever known them? Did I know them now, even now that they'd come out to me? Who were they? Who had they been? Who would they become? And would I ever be able to understand them as they understand themselves? I knew, as I had often told other parents, that however my child identified, and whether or not I understood it, my job was to love and care for them. But I still experienced my child's coming out as a crisis, the loss of what I believed was our shared understanding of gender and the familiar terms and the relationship that had been based on them that went with it. To many of us, this kind of crisis, the realization that there's no understanding or language of gender we can count on others, even those we love, to share, feels like a new kind of crisis. But though widespread awareness of gender diversity may be new, the sense of suddenly losing a common understanding and language of identity is not. In fact, Genesis describes exactly this kind of crisis in the first civilization that emerged after the flood that wiped out most of humanity. And I'm going to read the story, even though I suspect all of you know it. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said, "Come, let us build a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves. Else we shall be scattered all over the world." God came down to look at the city and tower that humanity had built. And God said, "If, as one people with one language, for all, this is how they've begun to act, then nothing that they propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech so that they shall not understand one another." Thus God scattered them from there over the face of the earth, and they stopped building the city. The Bible presents this brief story, and God, as the origin of what we now call diversity. It explains why human beings came to have so many different languages and cultures that we find it hard to understand one another despite our common humanity. When the story begins, everyone speaks the same language with the same words, sharing terms and understanding so completely that the entire post-flood population moves and acts as one, which you only get nowadays in like horror movies, you know. They're kind of like pod people. These days, there's never unanimous agreement about cultural change. But the people of Babel are so homogeneous, they all have the same reason for settling, building a city, and devoting themselves to making a tower. They all want to make a name for themselves because they all fear that if they don't concretize their shared identity, they will be scattered all over the world. We often think of anxieties about losing shared culture and identity as a reaction to diversity and the social changes that accompany it. But this story presents those anxieties as preceding diversity. Before there are any other cultures, languages, identities, or peoples in the world, the people of Babel are gripped by terror of losing their shared sense of who they are. In fact, their efforts to secure their common identity by building a tower brings about the very loss they feared. Though the people of Babel believe their shared identity can only be secured by a physical structure, the story emphasizes that it is the fact that they share the same language, the same terms and understandings, that holds them together. That's why God doesn't bother to destroy the city or the tower. Instead, God confounds their speech, so no one can understand or be understood by anyone else. Without a shared language, their shared identity vanishes, and they are, as they worried, scattered over the face of the whole earth. We can see the fears dramatized in this story. The fear of losing the shared language that enables us to identify ourselves and others in terms we all understand, and our current conflicts over gender. Like the lost language of Babel, binary gender is a shared language of identity, a language that enables those who embrace it to identify ourselves in ways that help us understand and feel understood by one another. When we identify ourselves in binary terms, we're not just individuals. We're women defined in relation to men, or men defined in relation to women, husbands or wives, mothers or fathers, sisters or brothers, daughters or sons, terms that translate our idiosyncratic individuality into roles and relationships founded on shared understandings of who we and others are, and of what it means to be human. By defining human beings as either and only male or female, binary gender promises that no matter where we are or how alone we feel, we can always identify ourselves and relate to others in terms we can count on everyone to understand, offering a stabilizing language of identity that can serve as a foundation both for our individual sense of who we are and for our relationships, families, and communities. And though a physical foundation couldn't secure the shared language and identity of the people of Babel, the physical foundation of binary gender, sexual dimorphism, the fact that most human bodies are either male or female, has enabled binary gender identities, language, and understandings to survive millennia of diversification, cultural change, and historical upheaval. Though binary gender has never been, as I grew up believing, universal, even in antiquity, people who were physically male or female could count on it being identified as men or women in vastly different times and places. For those accustomed, as I was most of my life, to thinking of binary gender as a universal, unchanging language of identity, the recent widespread recognition of trans and non-binary identities can feel like a Babel-like crisis, a confounding of long-shared understandings of who and what human beings are in ourselves and in relation to one another. Individual trans and non-binary people can also raise those fears. But as I found out when I came out at my Orthodox Jewish women's college, even those institutionally and religiously committed to binary gender can relate to trans and non-binary individuals without losing or even altering their own language of gender by treating us as exceptions. Whatever people at my university privately made of who and what I was, the university publicly referred to me by my post-transition name and pronouns, and continued to identify everyone else according to the maleness or femaleness of their bodies. But as gender-critical feminists, religious and cultural conservatives, and other critics of gender diversity efforts point out, institutionalized recognition, not just of individuals, but of trans and non-binary identities in general, threatens to confound the language of binary gender. For example, here's how gender-critical feminist and philosopher Kathleen Stock described the impact of recognizing self-determined trans and non-binary identities. Gender identity theory proposes huge revisions to woman and man, girl and boy. Some women, it says, are not adult human females, they're males. And some adult human females are not women, they're men or non-binary. Equally, some men aren't adult human males, they're females. And some adult human males aren't men, they're women or non-binary. Not just all that, but also, women, men, girls, and boys aren't beings you can ever directly identify by looking or listening, or by any other perceptual means. For the thing that supposedly makes you a woman, man, boy, girl, or boy is gender identity, an inner psychological state that has no reliable correlation with outer appearances. This would seem to mean a radical revision in our understanding of the related concepts, too, to make them about gender identity as well. Some adult human males, like me, would be mothers, stepmothers, grandmothers, daughters, sisters, aunts, and wives. And some adult human females would be fathers, grandfathers, sons, brothers, uncles, and husbands. Here, Stock points out two ways, her book details others, that recognizing trans and non-binary identities contradicts binary gender assumptions and confounds the shared language based upon them. First, by severing gender identity from physical sex, recognizing trans and non-binary identities creates what, in binary terms, is a series of oxymorons. Women who are physically male, adult females who are not women, and so on. As Stock's examples show, this means that even when we use the same binary terms, man, woman, and so on, to identify one another, those words mean different things to those like me who see gender as determined by individuals, and those who see gender as determined by physical and maleness and femaleness. And that is all true. I agree with what Stock says here, as uncomfortable as it makes me. In addition, as Stock says, because trans and non-binary identities are self-determined, so that only individuals can tell us what their gender identity is, recognizing those identities renders one of the most powerful features of binary gender inoperable, the ability to identify who others are and to be identified oneself based on outward appearances. Knowing that some people's gender identities don't match the sex of their bodies or the masculinity or femininity of their gender expression means we can't be sure what anyone's gender is unless they tell us. From this perspective, it's easy to see why, for Stock and others, widespread acceptance of trans and non-binary identities can feel like the kind of breakdown of shared language and understanding that confounds both the communal efforts and personal relationships of the people of Babel. Though I don't know how he reads the Babel story, I hear an echo of the fear it dramatizes in Pope Francis's 2016 warning that recognizing self-determined trans and non-binary identities denies the difference and reciprocity in the nature of a man and a woman, thereby eliminating the anthropological basis of the family. As human identity becomes the choice of the individual, one which can change over time. For Francis and other religious and cultural conservatives, institutionalized acceptance of gender diversity threatens every relationship and social structure based on binary gender, including the heteronormative family, and leaves nothing to found such relationships on but individual identities which, because they're self-determined and untethered to physical maleness and femaleness, can change over time. The concerns raised by Stock and Pope Francis aren't just theoretical or theological. Fear that recognition of trans and non-binary identities will confound the traditional language of binary gender has prompted the passage of scores of anti-trans laws that seek to protect binary gender by restricting teaching about gender diversity in schools, removing books that discuss it from libraries, and prohibiting public school teachers and other state employees from recognizing identities and using pronouns that don't fit individuals' physical sex. Other laws define gender as based on physical sex, with far-reaching consequences that include, most infamously, legally barring people like me from using restrooms that match our gender identities, outward appearances, and lives. Many non-trans people who accept trans and non-binary people and oppose discrimination against us also feel uneasy about the contradictions between the binary-based, physically rooted language of gender on which their own identities and relationships are founded, and the trans-inclusive, self-determined idea of gender that holds that people are what we identify ourselves as being. They may worry, as I did when my youngest came out to me, that they can't understand what trans and non-binary identities mean to those who embrace them, or how those identities relate to their own, or how accepting these identities may affect relationships, such as mother and daughter, traditionally based on binary gender. And trans or not, many of us worry about living in a world where there's no shared language or understanding of gender, a world in which we can't count on others to identify us as we identify ourselves, or be sure we're identifying others in terms they accept. The people of Babel's efforts to secure their identity brought about the very loss of identity they feared. Activists on one side of conflicts over gender fear that recognition of gender diversity will confound and fragment the unifying language of binary gender and destroy relationships, institutions, and communities based on it. Activists on the other fear that anti-trans backlash will leave trans and non-binary people with no officially recognized language of gender, and thus no recognized identities, no ways of being understood by others as we understand ourselves, which is the situation I and many of us grew up in, and in which those who live in strictly binary communities still face. But when we look at conflicts over gender, in other words, when we look at efforts to secure one language of gender or another, we see that they often inflame rather than resolving the problems that drive them. As activists fight to institutionalize the language of gender they embrace, they tend to mobilize supporters with anxiety-magnifying language that frames each conflict as part of an existential battle which only one language of gender will survive. Mobilizing though it may be, this kind of language makes it harder for those on opposing sides to try to understand one another, look for common ground, or focus on solving specific problems. In the Babel story, the kinds of fears that fuel conflicts over gender suddenly, catastrophically come true. All shared language is confounded, and all identities and roles, personal relationships and social structures cease to function because no one can understand or be understood by anyone else. It can be painful and scary to live in a post-Babel world of gender, but none of us, not even those who embrace binary gender and have always lived amidst others who do so, have ever lived in any other kind of world. While every dialect of binary gender agrees that human beings are either male or female, depending on their physical sex, the meanings each dialect gives to maleness and femaleness vary so widely among different times, places, ethnicities, religions, cultures, and even families that even those who identify in traditional binary terms can't count on others to understand them as they understand themselves. For example, for Pope Francis, the biological difference between male and female is the divinely determined basis of the roles, characteristics, qualities, strengths, weaknesses, desires, and proper lives of individual men and women, which are designed by God to complement one another in ways that foster heteronormative families. We're born that way, to just men and women just find each other, create families, have children. But secular feminists, including, I suspect, Kathleen Stock, reject the idea that gender is divinely created and determined. or that having a female body means that women are destined by God to complement, marry, bear children to, and accept the authority of men. For feminists, being a woman means being an individual who can and should determine her own desires, life choices, and destiny. And being a man means, among other things, being a beneficiary and maybe a perpetuator of patriarchal oppression and inequality. Because they both embrace dialects of binary gender, Pope Francis would identify Kathleen Stock as a woman, and she would identify Francis as a man. But man and woman have such different meanings to each of them that it's unlikely either would feel properly identified by the other. Which means that even if there were no trans or non-binary people, they would both know what it's like to share the world with people who understand gender in general and their own gender identities in particular in ways they disagree with, including ways they would consider severe, even insulting misidentifications. I personally find it hard to share a world with those I know embrace dialects of binary gender that identify me as a man or a female impersonator who, depending on the dialect, is seen as mentally ill, engaged in a public sexual act, or endangering women. In some dialects, I'm identified as an it, lacking the humanity required for gender identification, and thus any role or place in the gendered world. Being identified in ways that contradict or deny our own sense of who we are can feel like a deep and sometimes deliberately dehumanizing injury. We can also feel harmed when others give different meanings to the terms we embrace to identify ourselves. I feel this way when some in the LGBTQ plus world define transsexual as someone who promotes demeaning binary norms. Gender critical and anti-trans feminists describe similar feelings when people like me identify ourselves as women, despite having been born, raised, and living as male. For them, the term woman is defined by shared reproductive biology and the socialization and oppression which, in a still sexist world, go with them. Definitions that foster a sense of sisterhood and solidarity with other non-trans women. The acceptance of people like me as women threatens all that woman means to them, and to add insult to injury feels like yet another way in which the needs of those they identify as women are sacrificed to the needs of those they see as men. For Pope Francis and many other religious gender traditionalists, the injury done by both recognition of trans and non-binary identities, and for that matter, feminism, is not just to the meanings of particular gender identities, but to the meaning of gender itself. For them, gender is something built by God into the nature of humanity and assigned by God to each individual. Defining gender as self-determined, the way trans-inclusive languages of gender do, or as a system that should foster the equality and freedom of women as well as men, as feminist dialects do, undermines the idea that gender expresses both humanity's relation to humanity, both God's relation to humanity as a whole, and God's relation to each of us, and thus the divine human relationship they see as the basis of both religion and society. In other words, no matter what language of gender we embrace, it's hard to live with those who embrace different languages, not just because we fear losing our own, but because it's so easy to feel wronged and harmed by how others practice, talk about, and understand gender. But we know how to live in a world like this, surrounded by people who disagree with us about the basic terms of human existence. Because, as the Babel story reminds us, we've lived in this world from before the beginning of recorded history. As we struggle to acclimate to a post-Babel world of gender, we can learn a lot from the history of other conflicts between mutually incomprehensible or mutually contradictory ways of understanding what it means to be human, such as violent efforts to establish one form of religion as true and eliminate others, so that, religiously speaking, everyone on earth will have the same language and the same words. History tells us that such efforts are as futile as they are horrifying. But no matter how much violence we perpetrate, we can't eradicate others' ways of understanding the things that matter most to them. The same is true of conflicts over gender. No matter what insults we hurl, who we cancel, what laws we pass, or how many people we shun, silence, or murder, we can't return to the pre-Babel world of universally shared language that's promised, but's never been delivered by binary gender. For those of us engaged in conflicts over gender, that's both good news and bad news. On the one hand, it means our own language of gender can never be erased. On the other hand, it means that no matter what we do, the world will always be full of languages of gender that conflict with our own. The question then is not which language of gender is right or wrong, which should be universal and which should be eliminated. It's how we live in a post-Babel world of gender. Specifically, how can we maintain the sense of who we and others are that our own language of gender affords us, while peacefully managing conflicts that arise from living with others who don't share it? Here, the American history of responding to cultural diversity can offer useful lessons. For example, the cruelty and failure of past laws designed to punish those who live and think differently from whatever the majority feels is natural, true, or right show the results we can expect from current and future anti-trans legislation. But Americans have also developed effective ways to minimize friction between those who hold different beliefs, including protecting individual freedoms of belief and expression, protecting the rights of religious groups to live according to their own beliefs, and protecting individuals' rights to do what we choose in our own homes, as long as we're not hurting anyone else. These protections minimize conflicts by maximizing the space available for individuals and groups to live according to our own terms and understandings, alleviating fears that we'll be forced to do otherwise. Of course, the history of litigation of these rights also shows how flawed specific formulations of them can be, and how complicated even the best formulated rights can be to enforce justly and even-handedly. Moreover, no matter how they're formulated, history tells us that these rights have never eliminated all conflicts, and sometimes they even inflame them. But the history of American efforts to accommodate a wide range of beliefs and ways of life also shows that though conflicts over gender will always arise, they can be de-escalated and managed through dialogue, negotiation, mediation, goodwill, and, if those fail, litigation, as long as we focus on the specific problems and situations at hand, rather than trying to resolve which language of gender is true, just, or right. Even de-escalation and nonviolent management of conflicts can't prevent or completely redress the harms that can arise from conflicts over language of gender. Families, institutions, and communities that rely on a single language of gender, which is to say most families, institutions, and communities, will always be uncomfortable and sometimes unjust for those who embrace a very different understanding of gender. Laws and policies regarding how gender will be practiced will, like other laws and policies, produce both winners who feel supported and losers who feel disadvantaged or worse. But conflicts over gender are so intense now because they're driven by the fear of losing the understanding of gender on which our own lives are based. We can reduce this fear and hopefully the intensity of conflicts over gender by remembering that we live in a post-Babel world where many versions of gender have always existed side by side, a world in which no language of gender is universally shared or understood, but in which all can be spoken and lived. And living in a post-Babel world means more than ignoring other languages of gender when we can, tolerating, although that really works, I have to say. You can just forget about it. It's the way of reducing all conflicts. But it means, we can do more than ignoring other languages of gender when we can, tolerating them when we can't, and managing and de-escalating the anxieties and conflicts that come up when different languages collide. As I learned from teaching at Yeshiva University, living with different languages of gender, even those that misidentify or exclude us, can teach us how robust our own languages and identities are, and can illuminate what they give us, what they cost us, and how they could grow to include more of our own and others' humanity. Watching my students navigate contradictory dialects of binary gender, their own orthodox dialect, which said that gender is created by and given to them by God, and the secular American versions they simultaneously embraced and resisted, has forced me to understand gender and identity in new, more capacious ways, and enabled me to glimpse how I and others might live when we're accustomed to binary and trans-inclusive languages of gender coexisting in ways that now might seem hard to imagine. My students' faithfulness to orthodox ideas about what women are and should be, even as they're immersed in freer, more individualistic secular ideas, reminds me that gender can be more than a way of identifying ourselves in others, more even than a way of life we share, that it can also connect our individuals and identities and selves to generations before us, the future growing out of us, to divinity and all of creation. The better we manage anxieties and conflicts over gender, the easier it is to see the post-Babel world not just as the end of the dream. It was always just a dream, but being universally understood as we understand ourselves, but as awakening into the capacious humanity that gives rise to all these languages of gender. When we stop ignoring and battling against other languages and work to understand them, they can help us recognize the strengths and wrestle with the limitations of our own language of gender, address questions our language makes it hard to ask, and reclaim aspects of our own humanity our language of gender de-emphasizes or obscures. Whatever language we embrace, we can appreciate how trans and non-binary inclusive languages highlight the category confounding richness, complexity, and dynamic nature of human individuality. We can be challenged by the physicality of gender-critical feminist binary dialect to explore the profound, mysterious connections between our bodies and how we identify ourselves. We can be summoned by religious traditionalists to reckon with how we rely on gender to shape individuality into identities that foster enduring personal and communal relationships, and how our way of living gender reflects our understanding of humanity, our relation to God, and our place in the universe. The more languages of gender we understand, the easier it becomes to remember, and the harder it becomes to forget the common needs that give rise to all of them. The need to identify and understand ourselves and others, the need to be identified and understood, the need to be who we are, and the need to build lasting, mutually beneficial relationships with others. As long as we keep these shared needs in mind, then no matter how painful or scary it may be to interact with those who embrace different languages of gender, or how hard it is for us to understand or accept them, we will recognize those languages and those people as expressions of our shared humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for that thought-provoking lecture. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question for Joy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ladin. This is so very thoughtful. I am so interested in your own experience and then your resistance or being unnerved by the experience of your child. And what were the different dynamics there?
Well, these dynamics are, ongoing. As I described, and I think that this is true of many, although not all coming out stories. When coming out goes badly with people we love, I I've learned, and I often remind other people who are facing that, that the first reactions are the worst reactions, right?
Yeah.
It's a shock to realize that somebody you know well, in some ways you didn't know at all. And in those first moments, you're just, there's panic. There is really grief. There's a grieving process. We grieve when we lose versions of people that we love because we only love people that um, as we know them, right? And something like their gender, it's a foundational way that we know them. But I experienced that grief just from my mother's aging as she became elderly. I was angry at her. I was in denial for a long time. Then I was angry that how dare she so obviously cease to be the mother that I thought of her as being. And I would bargain, like, can we do this? Can we, like the whole thing. So I told other people they should expect to have to do that, but that is a long and iterative process where you circle back and back. And in those first coming out times, you're just overwhelmed by all the parts of the process and you haven't learned to live with them yet. So that was what I experienced. But I was lucky. My child had waited some years to come out. This is not a compliment to me as a parent. It's like, wow, I would have thought I was the safe parent, like they would come out to me right away. But they obviously knew that they needed to be pretty confident in themselves before they expose themselves to my reactions. Some people come out right away when they're so vulnerable, it's hard for them not to be hurt by others' reactions. Anyway, my kid let me know that my feelings were my problem and that they expected me to act like, no matter what I felt, they expected me to act like someone who was accepting and understanding and supportive of who they told me they were. And in AA, they say fake it till you make it. This actually works when someone comes out to you also. You can act like you accept someone as who they are, even when you're not sure who they are, right? And you can certainly act like you respect it. This is what my students, at Yeshiva University, like, they had no clue what I was when I came out to them. They'd never heard of trans people in Orthodox culture at that time. I was a reason that a lot of people found out about trans people. And some of them couldn't handle it at all, but the ones who did, they just looked past my gender, which they didn't understand, and they looked at my humanity. And they knew, because religion teaches us how to deal with other human beings, right? It teaches us how a human being should deal with somebody else they see as human. It offers a lot of guidance. Orthodox culture is rich in it, and that's what they did with me. So they treated me with compassion. They recognized the pain that I was going through, that was reflected in my transition, all that stuff, without understanding my gender at all. And I found that I could do the same thing with my child. I could say, well, I don't know what this does to the gendered aspect of our parent-child relationship, but I can see that it doesn't change our parent-child relationship. And I really like the gendered aspect of it, but the bottom line is you are still my kid, and I'm still my parent, and I'm in it for the long haul. So I don't need to be in a panic about figuring out who you are. In fact, somewhere around the age of 12 or 13, I think all parents learn that we're going to spend our lives learning new things about our children. And and being told by our children that we're behind the curve.
Yeah.
So in other words, I came to see it as something that was both a shock in the ways I'm describing and also, part of the job description and something that I had a lot of training in how to manage.
Thank you for your vulnerability and sharing this part of your life with us.
So welcome. There was a question in the chat that I think was...
I can read it, Joy, if you like.
Thank you.
Carol said, how can we as spiritual caregivers begin to learn new languages of gender?
What a wonderful question. You may actually be the first person to ask that question, because I'm not sure that anyone other than me in this talk is really thinking of languages of gender as what we're dealing with here. And so before answering that, I just want to point out that languages of gender is one of many ways you can characterize gender. I like it. First of all, I like it because I think that the Tower of Babel story really provides crucial framework for trying to understand the moment that we're in and the kinds of changes it is. And I also like it because language highlights the issue of understanding. And for me, as a trans kid, I used to have nightmares about not being understood by my parents. I would try to talk to them. It was like the Tower of Babel. They just couldn't understand what I was saying. And I see now that as an introjection of what I experienced with gender. They couldn't understand the me who was talking to them. It's an awful experience. Many of us, probably universal, all of us probably feel it sometimes. And calling gender a language highlights that. But Pope Francis would not call gender a language. He would call that part of gender ideology. Kathleen Stock, I think, would object to severing gender from sex in the way that calling gender a language would. So it's a useful term, but I'm going to have to do a lot of work before many people adopt it. So if you refer to languages of gender to other people, you probably have to do some teaching so that they understand what you mean by that. And particularly that what you mean by that is a way of accepting how they do gender and the terms they use without having to surrender your own. Because that's what I think we really get out of calling it language. I don't think anybody, does anybody remember the whole freedom fries controversy? There was some reason that we were angry at France. There's always some reason we're angry at France. And so there was a movement among House Republicans to rename French fries freedom fries, because you get to keep the alliteration, I guess. Anyway, right, so that most of us don't feel like we can't speak English if other people speak French, right? So the languages of gender model enables us to see different ways of doing gender the way we see different languages, just stuff that other people do. And it opens the question that you just asked, which is phenomenal. How do we learn those other languages? And I think language learning gives us a lot of really good clues there, right? You need to learn other languages by listening to other people speak them. Listening not the way, so when I'm in a conflict over gender, or when I'm feeling vulnerable or sensitive, like, let's say Kathleen Stock came over for dinner, and I suspect that she's charming in person. She's British, so, by definition, kind of charming in person. But let's say she decided to start dinner by saying, by the way, you're not a woman. You're just a man, right? And then I would be feeling terrible about that. I would have a lot of reactions to it. I would take that personally, because she's not only speaking her language of gender, but she is translating me personally into her language of gender. I don't think that kind of immersion is the best way of learning languages of gender that hurt us personally. I think it's easier to do that with binary languages of gender that sort of overlap with your own. You can. But it's harder when the language of gender, you're immersed in a language of gender that erases you or hurts you or insults you. So, but I can read Kathleen Stock. She's a wonderful writer, very, very clear thinker. I can learn to understand how she sees the world. That's a great way for me to do it without feeling like I'm personally on the line. And by doing that, it still hurts to read Kathleen Stock and other anti-trans people talking about gender. But I can become accustomed to that pain and that shock. And I can most importantly, I can learn what this language of gender means to them. And I think that that's as a caregiver, you don't necessarily have to really understand somebody else's language of gender from the inside. I do think as a caregiver, you want to use their language of gender to identify them. That's always a good idea, even if you don't know what it means. But you don't need to understand it from the inside so much as you need to be able to understand what it means to them. That's what the kind of understanding that's necessary. If you're doing work on this, though, if you're not just a caregiver, like it's not just your one-to-one with someone who speaks a different language of gender, but you're trying to foster understanding of make room for different languages of gender in your community, then I think there's a different kind of challenge where you want to show people that you understand their language of gender well enough that they don't have to be afraid that you're actually trying to change their community in a way where it's erased. So activism around gender is always going to raise the fear of being erased. In spiritual caregiving, it's more like, and we know this, we know that individuals, particularly individuals in need of care, are highly vulnerable, and that the language we use is one of our most effective means of either making them feel cared for or making them feel alienated from us so that they can't feel cared for by us. So at least trying to understand what words to use, how they want to be understood and seen, and how to speak in ways that make it clear that you accept those terms, that you respect them, that you're not putting them in air quotes, that you're not struggling to say them, right? The way my wife actually speaks French and she won't let me pronounce French words because she's offended by the pronunciation. So I think if somebody tells you they identify as non-binary and they say it that way, non-binary, I don't know if everybody says it that way, you don't want to say, well, you as a non-binary person, right? Like that's important. But honestly, I have no idea what anybody means by non-binary because it's defining themselves in terms of what they aren't, not in terms of what they are. So another way you can understand their language of gender, if it's relevant to the care, is by inviting them to tell the story of their gender. This is something we all have in common. We all have to live our own individuality in terms of shared languages of gender that we move into and out of and that mean different things to us at different times. Everybody's like that. And we can only really understand what the person in front of us means by the gender terms they use to identify themselves, even if they're common. Like, even if they're physically female, identify as a woman, you're physically female, you identify as a woman, even then, you're not going to know what woman means to them until you hear their story of living femaleness and how it's changed for them and what it means right now. And I think everybody here knows that what it means to you to be a woman changes in adolescence multiple times often. It can change when you get married. It changes when you get divorced. It changes when you get pregnant. It changes when you have a child. It changes when you have a job. Many kinds of jobs come in built in with gender definitions to them. So our stories of gender are complicated and individual and idiosyncratic. And once we realize that if we want to understand what anyone's language of gender means, we need to listen to their story as a human being. I think we can stop being afraid of the differences between language, because I don't think it's about understanding gender theory. I think it is about understanding something we share with them, which is we're really different and individual as human beings, and that gives us a loneliness that makes us all long for shared terms to identify ourselves in so that others will understand us at least partly. But none of us have terms that we fit exactly. So we all know how it feels like to move in and out of different understandings of those terms, to rewrite them privately, to come out to others as being a kind of this or that they didn't think we were. We all get that. And at that level, if you're a spiritual caregiver, I think you have a lot of practice listening to and understanding someone else's story of who they are. Because I think that that's the level at which spiritual care is most effective and most life-changing. And it reminds me of that great George Herbert poem, Prayer. He goes through these fantastic definitions of prayer. They make me want to pull my hair out with envy because they're such great poetry. And then his last definition is something understood. Prayer is something understood, the feeling of being understood. And when you're a spiritual caregiver, you may not be able to do anything to improve the lives of the suffering person you're sitting with, except give them the feeling of being understood. So that's, I think, what matters with the language of gender in a spiritual care situation. When you're trying to work to create room for multiple gender languages, recognition of them in your community, then I think it helps to have at least a passing knowledge of different languages of gender and how other people use them. I'm sorry, I don't know how useful that was, and I went on and on.
That was very useful. Thank you so much, Joy. Let's give Joy another round of applause. I'd like to invite President Molly Marshall to come up to give a final blessing to send us off.
Before I do, I simply want to thank Rye and Justin and Cindy Beth and Stella and wherever MJ is for your good help in making this a good time. Thank you all for being here. She ended with a bit from Herbert. I'll end with a bit from St. Augustine. I was reminded how he said in his Confessions, I have become a mystery to myself. And I think as we have talked about challenging, significant things, striving for a shareable world, we understand the degree to which we remain fearfully, wonderfully made, and yet a mystery as we seek greater understanding. The Celtic tradition likes to say, my blessing goes with you, and I offer that to you, every blessing. Thank you.